Thank you, John. That was a lovely introduction. As he said, I'm going to talk give a little lightning whiz through some early travellers in Mughal lands. But before I get started, I'm going to give a little preface to that, because it occurs to me that it's all very well, talking about people actually travelling in India, but in the 17th and 18th centuries, which is when my sort of specialty in writing is, it was incredibly difficult just to get to India at all, to get to the subcontinent at all. Almost all, in fact, pretty much every single traveller who went there, and I'm talking about the 17th and 18th centuries, had to do it through the East India Company, which had been founded in 1600. And the East India Company boats were very, very small. They were the biggest of them, I think, was something like 870 nautical tons. And that meant absolutely nothing to me at all. And so I asked someone if they would translate it into kind of layman's terms, and that is, roughly speaking, about the size of 3 double-decker buses put together. So that is an absolutely tiny space. And in fact, the lovely boat on the Hooghly River that John's tour is on, I was looking at it when I was doing the tour a year and a bit ago, and thinking, is this boat about the size of an East India Company, galleon? And it would be probably about the same size as that. But in this tiny little, in the case of the East India Company boat's wash tub, you would be incarcerated for a total of about 8 to 9 months, is how long you would be at sea before you got even to Surat, so the nearest place in India that you could get to. If you were going all the way around to Calcutta, it would be even longer. So that is between now and pretty much Christmas this year. That's a really long time. So you were at sea for a very long time in these rather very cramped, very insanitary conditions. And so diseases such as cholera and typhoid and what the people of that time called the bloody flux, which was dysentery, could rip through the whole crew on the boat and kill most of the people on board. And I came across this extraordinary, very alarming description of a boat that reached the Spice Islands, which is what we now call which is now Indonesia. And every single person on board this boat was either dead or about to die. And the crew numbered about 140 people. So, it was a perilous thing. If you didn't get sick, the chances are that your European competitors in India, that would have been the Portuguese. In the Spice Islands, it would have been the Dutch. Later on, it would have been the French, all of whom were not very keen to see the upstart English sailors on their patch, so they would attack you. But more so than anything else, probably the greatest danger was the weather. And there's an extraordinary description, and I often read this out, but I don't really have time to do that, so I'm going to give a little précis of this. And it's a first-hand account by a man called William Hickman. He was a famous diarist, and he and his wife, I write about quite a lot in my book, and they were survivors of a cyclone when they were on one of these trips. They were actually on their way to Calcutta, and it's the most terrifying description. I have a real fear of big waves, so for me it was an absolutely horrific account. They described how this weather front came slowly, so they could see it on its way. And when they were in the eye of the storm, it was so ferocious that one by one, all 3 of the masts on this boat just snapped. They snapped like walking sticks. The bulkheads, in which so the bits in between the different heights of the boat where you'd make your cabin, were just blown out by the force of the water. They saw the captain being washed overboard by an enormous wave and then amazingly washed back again onto the boat. The second, the captain's deputy had himself lashed to the remaining stump of the mast and eventually he just literally collapsed because he was so exhausted. And number 3 in charge couldn't be seen anywhere, so they just imagined that he must have been, drowned at sea. And they found him hidden in a cubbyhole with a large bottle of brandy, not wanting to come out. But probably the worst and most frightening thing of all was that they were a Portuguese crew. And this Portuguese crew, I think you really know you're in trouble if your crew start to panic, were screaming and yelling and shouting and clawing to get their hands on the priest who was with them had a crucifix. And they were so desperate to get their hands on this crucifix, they literally ripped it to bits. Anyway, I'm happy to tell you that the beautiful boat on the Hoovy that you can go in, nothing like that at all. It's a beautiful 5-star boat. And I kept thinking when I was on it, oh my goodness me, thank goodness I am a child of the 21st century and not born in the 17th. You know, you could have massages, you could get your nails done, you have wonderful food. Anyway, it is not at all like this. So this was the situation for these sailors who were on these East India Company trips, particularly the very early ones. That was for the men. If you were a woman, the situation was even more perilous because you were considered to be unlucky. You know, no one wanted you on board, and so these poor women were consigned to the deepest bowels of the boats and only allowed to come up for air, very infrequently. And in any case, in the first part of the 17th century, the East India Company banned women completely. Didn't want any women to be. Women were expensive, they were a nuisance, they did not want to have the bother of these women. But in 1617, so that was 17 years only after the East India Company was founded, 2 extraordinary women managed to slip through the net of all these prescriptions and dangers, and they were on this ship, this flotilla of ships. They were on something called the New Year's Gift. On their way, they were going all the way to Surat, which is the great Mughal port in India. And the reason that they were able to do that, to get round all these rules, was that they had been employed as women companions to a 3rd woman, who was a woman called Mariam Towson. And Mariam Towson was an Armenian Christian lady from Agra, so the Mughal capital, who had been married in quite quick succession to 2 separate East India Company captains. One of them was called Captain Towson, and the first one that she was married to was a man called Captain Hawkins, and so who died, and she was anyway on her way back to Agra. So these ladies had managed to become, employed by her as her companion. So the East India Company allowed them to go. And I will tell you, if I have time, I had a clock here that somebody took away. How am I doing for time? You're okay. Keep going. Okay. If I don't get through it all, you'll have to come on the Hoovy cruise and installment. Anyway, William Hawking, who was married to this woman, Mariam Towson, is an absolutely fascinating character. He was from Devon, and he was from a famous family of mariners. So Hawkins is a famous, name of mariners. And there was a William. They were all called William. They were all called either William or John. So it's really difficult to know which one is which. But there was a William Hawkins who fought in the Armada. There was another William Hawkins who went round the world with Drake. Whether it's the same William Hawkins, I don't know, but he would have been related to him. And he went in one of the very, very early trips, 1609, the 3rd of the East India Company's trips to Surat. And he was given a mission, and his mission was that he had to go and make friends with the Mughal emperor and get permission to build a factory, which is a trading station in Surat, and permission for the English to be able to trade. So the boat literally dropped this man off in Surat, and then it went off it was going to the Spice Islands, so the Surat was just a pit stop on the way. It dropped this man, William Hawkins, with one other merchant only, a man called William Finch, and 2 sons, and then they just waved goodbye and they left him. And this man was at the Mughal court, and he had to make his way all the way to Agra, a journey of 600 miles, which was pretty pretty extraordinary that he managed to do that at all. And he did it by employing a Pathan, horse riders, 50 Pathans, so Afghans, to be his guard and take him to the Mughal capital. So this rough and ready sea captain arrives in Agra in 1609, it was by then, it took him nearly a year to get there, to this extraordinary, luxurious, rich, beautiful city of palaces and water gardens and water features and, Mughals, noblemen dressed in the most beautiful silks and embroideries. I mean, this was one of the most sophisticated and richest capitals in the whole world. And this salty old Devonshire bloke tips up in Agra, and he's expected to get a trading treaty with Jahangir, the Emperor Jahangir. So it was a pretty tall order. He was all on his own with just two other, his cook and his boy, and he was given an audience with Jahangir, and absolutely amazingly, they hit it off. And this is because William Hawkins had two trump cards up his sleeves. He was able to speak Turkish, and the Jahangir spoke Turkish, so he could communicate very easily with Jahangir. And he was really, really good at drinking. And Jahangir, despite being this very, very sophisticated man interested in astronomy and all these things and beautiful calligraphy and poetry and everything that you can imagine, was an alcoholic and he was addicted to opium as well, and it's very well attested. So, William Hawkins was his man. So William Hawkins became Jahangir's kind of drinking buddy for a period of about 2 years. And he failed, by the way, to get his trading treaty, unfortunately. But goodness me, he gave it his best shot. And he had the Portuguese there who were machinating against him. He had all the snake pit of the Mughal court. Can you imagine what that was like? All also machinating against him. And he managed to survive this experience, but he became very alarmed. He thought that he was going to be poisoned because his cook died in mysterious circumstances, and the other, what he was his boy, also became very ill. So he was very worried that his enemies were going to get him, and so he confided in the emperor, in Jahangir. And Jahangir said, probably after quite, having had a few, said to him, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to find you a wife. That's what you need. You need a wife. Because a wife will prepare all your food, and then you will know that you're not going to be poisoned. So of course, William Hawkins had absolutely no intention whatsoever of getting married to a Mughal lady, and he went, no, I couldn't possibly, I'm so sorry, I'm a Christian, I couldn't possibly marry a Muslim. And the emperor said, oh, don't worry, I've got just the person for you, I've got this Armenian Christian lady. So this woman called Marianne Khan, so by that stage, William Hawkins could not possibly refuse the emperor, and so he married this woman. And amazingly, it was quite a success, and they got on rather well. And it was, I think they were quite happy together. They left. William Hawkins did not get the trading deal that he was wanting, so he left when the next ship came into Surat, and he went off with his lady, with this Marianne Khan, she was called. And very sadly, on his way back to England, he died. And so Marianne Hawkins, as she briefly was, then married this other sea captain called Marianne Towson. And so when these two women were on their way to Surat in 1616, I mean, that's really, really early. That's within less than 2 decades of the East India Company being founded. These two women found their way, got employment with Marianne, who was on her way home. How am I doing? I think I should stop now. You can have an exciting instalment. Anyway, they got to Surat. One of the women turned out to have been married secretly to another sailor. She was pregnant. There's a whole appalled correspondence from the sea captain saying, what are we going to do with this woman? She's going to have a baby on board. And this wasn't our idea. They arrived in Surat. She had the baby. And then they all went off to Agra and one of the women, whose name was Mrs. Hudson, traded in, took some money with her, she traded in cloth, and she went home a rich woman. So she is one of the she merchants of my of my book, which is called She Merchants, Buccaneers and Gentlewomen. And because someone's taken my job, I don't know how long I've been talking, but I suspect that I should probably stop it there. Anyway, like I say, next exciting instalment in 2027 in Calcutta, so come and join me then. Anyway, thank you very much.